Hi, welcome back. This is the next lesson from chapter 1. This is covering spontaneous generation. So the text presents this journey through the history of microbiology with major questions that were being asked during these particular periods of time in history. And so this one is spontaneous generation possible? Well, what is spontaneous generation? It was the belief, the idea that living things can come from non-living things. So like a dry mud puddle after a rain could bring forth frogs and worms and stuff. I'm going to read you a little story here from one individual's understanding of how mice are made. And this was a long-standing belief. So people explain things based on their observations. There wasn't the field of like science yet. There was naturalists. They just made observations and said, okay, so this is how we're going to explain this because this is what we see. The scientific method wasn't really in use yet. The repetitions and controlled variables and experimental none of that really was a thing. And so if you had Aristotle putting forth this idea that was been accepted for almost 2,000 years, it's a little bit hard to go against that. So here's kind of the mindset that people had. So this is from a guy named Jean-Baptiste van Helmont. He was a chemist, but again, chemist slash naturalist slash, whatever you want to do back in the 1600s. So this is around 1620 is when he made this statement. It's a recipe for making mice. For if you press a piece of underwear soiled with sweat together with some wheat in an open-mouthed jar, after about 21 days, the odor changes and the ferment coming out of the underwear and penetrating through the husks of the wheat changes the wheat into mice. But what is more remarkable is that mice of both sexes emerge from the wheat, and these mice successfully reproduce with mice born naturally from parents. But what is even more remarkable is that the mice which came out were not small mice, but were fully grown. Imagine that. So this was, you get some dirty underwear, you stick it in a bag of wheat, and 3 weeks later, you're going to get some mice. So the mice had to have come from the dirty underwear and the wheat, right? That's your observations. We now know, obviously, that that's not the case. That's pretty obvious for mice. But what about bacteria? Now that people knew bacteria because of microscopes, there was still this long-standing belief about spontaneous generation. So let's take a look at some attempts through the years to disprove this idea of spontaneous generation. Sometimes it's called abiogenesis, so no life making. So making of life without life. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at a couple more guys dealing with this issue of spontaneous generation. So we have Needham and Spallanzani. So Needham, over here on the left in the red jacket, he did some experiments that supported spontaneous generation, and Spallanzani refuted spontaneous generation. Make sure I get my names right. Yes, Needham supported spontaneous generation. Okay, so let's take a look at what they did. So they each kind of did a similar experiment. So they got a flask, right? They put some broth in there and they boiled it. So here's my little flames. So they cooked it because they knew heating stuff up would prevent things from growing, but they didn't really know why. So what Needham did was he boiled his broth and then he sealed it with a cork. So there's my little cork here. And so he boiled it, and then after a couple days, let that cool for a while, and after a couple days, he noticed critters floating around in his broth. And he's like, aha, I told you, I boiled my broth, I sealed my flask, and bacteria and critters still grew. So this is supporting spontaneous generation. However, remember when I said there's not a lot of good science going on yet? You might think of some things that he could have done incorrectly that could have contaminated or prevented sterilization of his broth. Well, when he heated it up, maybe he didn't heat it up long enough to kill all the microbes in the original broth. Also, are cork a good seal? No, they're porous. So even though he may have sealed it from the outside world, things could still have gotten through that particular seal, right? All right, so that was Needham. And he was in good, scientific social circles. So all of that supported the longstanding belief of spontaneous generation. Oops, I erased my flask. So let's get Spallanzani in here. So he does the same thing. He boils his broth and he boils it for a really long time. So there's the flame. And then not only does he boil it for a really long time, but then he turns the flame on the neck of the tube and he seals it completely off. So he seals it. So not just a cork, but the glass is melted shut. And after a couple days, take the flame away, you just let the flask sit there. No growth. It stayed clear. There was no contamination. But again, you're trying to go up against a 2,000-year-old belief. People were arguing that by sealing the flask, he cut off the life force. There was a mysterious oxygen, air, magical thing that you had to come into contact with the organisms, because if he sealed off the life force, that's why they didn't grow, not because the flask itself was just sealed or blocked out from the rest of the environment. So this was taking place in the mid to late 1700s. Reddy's meat experiment was in the mid to late 1600s. So we're talking about 100 years go by after Reddy did his fly and meat experiment. We're still arguing about spontaneous generation. So then here comes Louis Pasteur. Now, most of you might be familiar with him because of his idea of pasteurization, which we'll talk about in the next video when we talk about fermentation. But he was really, his first major contribution to microbiology was refuting 100% that life cannot arise from non-living things. So he kind of did the same idea as Needham and Spallanzani. As you can see, his flasks, they have the little gravy, brothy stuff in them. But instead of corking them closed or sealing them completely off, he took that flask and he used heat, and with glass, you can draw out the neck of the flask into this long, what's called a swan neck. So this double curve neck of the flask. And so what he did was he boiled the broth. He let the steam kind of boil up through here, and the steam is going to help disinfect and clean out the whole tube. So here comes the steam out this way. And so then he let these flasks, he made a lot of them, he let them incubate, or basically he just stuck them under the stairs in a warm, dark place, and they didn't get contaminated. Day after week, after month, after years, after centuries, I still think there might be a few of his swan neck flasks uncontaminated in some museum in France somewhere, I think. So what he did find, though, is no growth. But what he noticed was in this curve right here, there was dust speckles that kind of gathered as they came in that opening, but they couldn't move up that skinny neck because there's no current to move these air particles. So when he tipped the flask and let the broth kind of come out and touch that collected dust, and then he tipped it back in. He didn't do anything else, just let the broth touch the dust. He tipped it back in and let that sit under the stairs, and by the next day it was cloudy. So he's like, if it just sits there, no cloudiness, no growth. If he touches the broth to the dust, growth. Some of them he just broke the whole neck off and just let it sit, growth. So he's like, all right, it's not a life force thing because I allowed oxygen or the life force or whatever to come into the flask, and they still didn't grow. So he was kind of the end all to the idea of spontaneous generation. Okay, so that is the end of our spontaneous generation discussion. All right, I will see you in the next video.